We are live here from our national studio in Toronto. Thank you very much for joining us on Facebook and YouTube. I have to look at my notes to make sure I have this right, and Periscope. And so for the next half hour or so, we're going to be talking to the pop culture panel. And why don't I have each of you quickly introduce yourselves? Stephen, starting with you.
I'm Stephen Marsh, random Toronto writer.
I'm Donovan Bennett, less random, I guess.
You got a job.
I write and I host for Sportsnet.
And I'm Sarah Boswell. I'm senior writer at Chatelaine. I'm on a mat leave right now.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you for having me. Well,
When did
supposed to be not working.
Yeah,
like it's no work at all.
When did you have your baby?
3 weeks ago.
And everything's going well?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So we are so happy to have all of you, but we weren't expecting to have you on here so quickly.
I'm full of surprises.
That is terrific. Speaking of surprises, Louis C.K., the comedian, is one of the first topics we want to talk about. He's surprised a lot of people by showing up at comedy clubs in New York City, including the Comedy Cellar. Have any of you guys been to the Comedy Cellar?
I have.
Yeah.
The best.
Yeah.
Awesome experience.
Well, you know what? I can say the year. I wasn't going to say the year because Donovan might mock me, but first time I went to the Comedy Cellar was 1986. I was a student.
Okay.
A bunch of us went there because we couldn't afford to go to catch a rising star. And I've been there every time I go to New York. It's one of the stops I make, and it is a fantastic place.
Did anyone cool show up when you were there? Like, 'cause it's all about like the celebrities.
Yeah, you know,
in.
like first of all, I think almost every comedian I've seen there has been really good, or at least good. And Ray Romano showed up one time, just randomly. What's the guy's name who, he's on 30 Rock. And anyway, he showed up.
With a hat? Judah Friedlander?
Yeah, Judah Friedland showed up. Apparently,
I want props.
Yeah, that's very good. Considering my clues were terrible.
Yeah. In your head.
Anyway, so he showed up. So yeah, so I've had that experience as well. But Louis C.K. showed up at the Comedy Club or Comedy Cellar and a few other clubs in New York City. And you know what? There's been mixed reaction, but some people really angry, feeling that a guy who has admitted to sexual, what would you call it? Misconduct?
Yeah.
Assault. I mean.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if he. I mean, he. What did he do? I mean, I think we can say this: masturbated in front of co-workers. So I don't know. Anyway, whatever it is, clearly inappropriate. He has admitted that he did it. He basically was out of work for a while, and so too soon for him to come back.
I don't know if too soon is the way I would frame it. I think the way that he has come back is what's more interesting and of note to me, and I think people are really watching in that way. I don't agree that we should just ban these people for life. Certainly if you've acknowledged your behavior, if you've apologized for it, which he did apologize for it, but there were some issues with the way he did that too, right? It did not seem quite genuine or remorseful and in really honest, heartfelt, authentic ways. It was kind of something he had to do. He'd also been trying to suppress that story for a long time. So that's the other context as well. So now the notable thing about him coming back is that he's making jokes about how hard done by he has been. You know, he's all about sort of his self-deprecating, I'm just kind of a schmo thing. You know, that's his comedy. And so he's now using this as material. He's saying, oh, I've lost $35 million in a minute. And that's like, you know, wah, I'm sorry. But he hasn't said anything or acknowledged in any way that he, you know, has limited opportunities for a lot of women with his behavior, that he has, you know, really acted in a way that is just damaging and harmful more systemically, and really no kind of authentic acknowledgement of that, and instead just turning it all into like poor me jokes. And so I think that takes us really far away from, you know, the real victimhood here, which is that these women have been harmed. And I'm not saying you need to be, you know, kept out of work forever about that, but I think you can acknowledge it in a way that is productive, and he's not doing that.
To say nothing of being committed to, you know, he could come out and say, look, not only is what I did inappropriate, but here's what I'm going to try to do to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. Certainly not going to happen with me, but what I can try to do to make sure it doesn't happen in other areas where I have some influence. Because he's a guy
like that
who used to have lots of influence. Donovan.
Yeah, it would be nice if he did that, right? I think we all, if we were talking to him personally, would advise him to do that. But I think the real question is, who is going to be the gatekeeper that says your level of contrition has reached yay high, you can now perform your craft? Like, do you want that responsibility? Well, apparently.
Obviously, I'm a gatekeeper.
No, but hang on a second. So what do you mean?
It does matter those people who make those decisions.
What's that?
It does matter those people who make those decisions, you know.
I don't think it matters that much, to be honest.
Do you want?
Well, sorry, go on.
No, go on.
Well, like, I think, you know, in America, the market wins. And like the question is actually, you know, we live in a very narrow world of debates around these questions, ones that are often framed in these conservative, liberal forms. But you have to remember, like, you know, 80% of Americans hate political correctness. Right? And they're also used to thinking of comedians as bad people, right? Like that's been true certainly since you went to the Comedy Cellar in 1986, that was true.
You're going to say that again?
Right?
Mayor Romano was a really bad guy.
1986.
I was there as well that night. I was. I was 3. I was being nursed by my mom.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, I think part of the problem here is that it's such a despairing situation because when these campaigns of social media shaming, you know, both sides are right? Like, if I were one of these women that he had done this to, I would feel absolutely appalled that he has suffered no real consequences for his actions. None.
Well,
and on the other hand,
no.
it's like, I
wouldn't say none. I mean, he's
very minor.
He's lost
That's all
$35
relative.
million a minute.
Well,
I mean,
he
did lose
lost
his
the show,
opportunities, yes.
the movie. His manager no longer works with him.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not as if he just press reset in his career.
No, he
is
didn't
back
suffer
where it was.
any consequences, but I mean,
Well, the way we all think about him is different.
yeah.
Yes, that's true.
That is
That's true. Public shaming, that's what it does. But it doesn't, I mean, we all think about him differently, but there's also no one can say that justice has been served. And because justice hasn't been served in any kind of external or objective way, it's how do you let him back, but also how do you exclude him?
So let me jump back in and ask you a series of questions that I want all of you to weigh in on with him coming back. But first of all, I want to read one of the comments that we got in on Facebook. John Braun in Vancouver says, and this actually he said this just before you made a similar comment, let the market decide. Not that you said it should decide, but you said it would decide.
It will decide, yeah.
John Braun says, let the market decide. If he shows enough, if he has shows and enough people go, then he's relevant and obviously still popular with the public. And so and we do welcome more comments, more questions that I'll read here. But so first question to all of you, and you guys can all jump in and debate this. If you're a comedy club owner, and the New York Times on The Daily, their fantastic podcast, had an interview with the owner of the Comedy Cellar. They posted it yesterday, and they asked him this question. But I ask you, you're the owner of the Comedy Cellar. Should you, right now, allow him on stage?
I would have a pre-conversation with him, and I know they pride themselves on, like, they can just launch in and it's always a big surprise, but like I would, if I knew and anticipated that he would want to come back, I'd have a conversation with him to be like, where are you really at on this? Are you going to maybe say something that feels that is truly authentic about this issue, and then make a decision about whether he's just like, no man, I got all this great material about how I'm a total victim here, and then maybe I would think, you know, I'm not sure that I think that that's a good thing. And speaking of the market, I think what Louis C.K. is doing is that he knows that there's a huge market of people who hate political correctness, as you were pointing out. He knows that there are a number of people who care a lot more about men's reputations and the ability to make a livelihood than they do about women being subject to sexual violence. You know, and I think that's all aside from the social media shaming thing. You know, I think there's just, you know, it's advantageous to him that so many people just do not care about women. So
if you were the owner of the Comedy Cellar, you would ask him some questions beforehand.
Yes,
and
then
if
make a
he
decision.
didn't meet your requirements of what would be appropriate,
I would say do a little bit more work.
Yeah,
you know, do some more work and then come back.
Donovan, owner of the Comedy Cellar, what do you do?
I would start from a place in his situation of yes, but I would have questions as well. But to me, the question would be about what his content is going to be. The first night he went out, he made a joke about a rape whistle. Given his history, that's not necessarily something that should be coming out of his mouth. But if he is, you know, making fun of himself, that's something I would be comfortable with. Kevin Hart is a great example. Not a similar crime, but he cheated on his wife. Morally, not something that's been great. He's been on tour, he's been well received, but part of his stand-up was about that situation and reflecting inward on why that was a mistake and how he's tried to do better. He's made fun of himself. He's
As a
made
human being, right?
He's made lemonade out of a terrible situation that could have curtailed his career. If that's the direction he's willing to go in, then sure, I'm happy to be part of that rehab process.
But again, echoing Sarah, I think you are saying that. See, 'cause the reason I ask this, it's interesting. Like often in the comedy context, people say it's not for us to edit or censor.
There's a lot
right?
of concern about censorship.
We
right?
just
Yeah.
sit back and anything goes. But as the New York Times podcast pointed out, they make decisions all the time at comedy clubs about who goes on. Usually the decision is that person funny or not?
Yeah.
It's not like anybody on the street or even any star has an absolute right to go on stage. So the owners do play the role of gatekeepers. So you guys have described how you would control that gate. Stephen, what about you?
You know, it's so hard for me to say because I feel so much on the other side. Like, I hate the gatekeepers and I hate the suits so intensely. And, you know, I always feel that they fail in their picks all the time anyway. I mean, I really, you know, I think the reason he put him on is because he knew he could produce an unbelievable set because he's Louis C.K. and he is a monster, but he's also unbelievably gifted at comedy. And, you know, I mean, maybe it's because I come from this more from a historical point of view. Like, I have a PhD in Renaissance.
Do you really?
Yeah,
I didn't
in
know
Renaissance
that.
literature, yeah.
Wow, all the
And,
time we've talked, you just introduce yourself every time as random writer.
Yeah.
You have a PhD
Yeah, you need
in
to
what?
put all your
in early modern
credentials at the
drama,
end.
right? Like,
Really?
yeah.
Wow.
I was a professor.
He's bearing the
Oh,
lead
yeah,
over here.
yeah. Well,
So modest.
Yeah, well, this is the
it
first.
really,
this
it
is-
really doesn't matter. Like, just
No,
so you
no,
know,
but
like,
I'm
Let's talk about how
any
modest
idiot
you
can get a
are.
PhD.
No, that's
it
not.
really is
that's
not that impressive.
That's not true. And I'm asking you the questions. You're not telling me. I'm very impressed. I had no idea. Anyway, back
But
to
my
your
point is, like, if you were to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you were to take out the art of everyone who's evil, everyone who's a pedophile, everyone who's a murderer, everyone who's a rapist, you would lose Caravaggio, you'd lose a lot of art. And if you went through the 20th century and did it, you'd lose a lot of art too.
But you'd also have a deterrent, and you'd have a platform.
You
so
wouldn't
the
have
next
any-
generation of
Well,
artists
that's it. You
wouldn't
wouldn't-
act the same way.
That's it. You wouldn't have any art, you'd have a deterrent. Now, see, to me,
Well,
I
hang
want
on a
the
second.
art.
There's a middle line there, right?
Yeah, I
you
think
could have
so.
some art and a deterrent. It's not like every single person who's produced fine art has done something so reprehensible they couldn't have
Well,
their
and your
art in a
art doesn't
public
have to
gallery.
Artists
be
have
the
traditionally
reprehensibility.
been considered demonic, right? Like that, and that has been known for a long time. Like Robert Johnson why does he play the guitar so well? Because he made a deal with the devil, right? Like this is
Well,
this
you
is
know,
not
okay, but hang on a
artists are
second.
bad
I mean,
people.
That's a
Dolly
well,
Parton
the-
is a Satanist.
Well, Dolly Parton dressed like a prostitute. She dressed like an immoral. And she said that.
I'm trying to make every panel about Dolly
I know.
Parton.
She dressed like a prostitute exactly to be immoral.
Okay, press pause for a sec. Let me read this
That's what my
comment. And
PhD
again, I welcome all of you. Yes, that's why you got your PhD, to make that point. Sharon Mustos, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, M-U-S-T-O-S, on Facebook says, I was actually sorry I went to his last show. I think she means Louis C.K., not Stevens. He was always a bit cranky. Maybe it is Stephen. I don't know. Part of his charm, I thought, but he seemed really mean and angry, like he was miserable. He's a frustrated filmmaker in any event, but needs his comedy to fund his art, quote unquote. And Justin Whitby on Facebook says, he's a funny man. How I view his humor separate from what he's done. Let the man make his amends. Well, let me jump to that, because one of you talked about this before. Donovan, I think it was you, in terms of how we feel differently about Louis C.K. I think the way you feel about a comedian really affects the way his or her comedy works on you.
Yes.
I mean, if it's Andrew Dice Clay, you expect an angry guy on there. But Louis C.K., as I think you pointed out, was the everyman,
Yes.
right? And he looked like if you were like shooting a Canadian Tire commercial and wanted a guy, raking his leaves
He would
on a
be raking
Saturday
the
afternoon,
leaves.
he'd be the guy you'd
Yeah.
get,
But
right?
he was also
Grumbling about
woke.
it.
He also played woke, remember?
Yeah.
I mean, Aziz Ansari going on tour now, this is the other thing we
Yeah.
haven't talked about. Like, what's he done? He's gone anti-PC.
Yeah.
Leave your phone and
Who has?
as Aziz Ansari.
Right.
So like he's saying political correctness has gone too far.
Yep.
You know, I mean, I don't mean to say this is insulting to the American public, but if Cosby when Cosby gets out of jail, if he decides to do a show, it will sell out, right? Like that is the world we're living in. And,
That's what I'm saying about Louis C.K. knowing his audience here. And
Yeah.
Aziz Ansari is doing the same thing. And he had been trying to be woke before. And then all of a sudden he's been victimized by, the way that this public shaming machine has worked and so on and so forth. And instead now sees an audience on the other side of that fence. That's happened in a lot of cases.
We're going to change topics in a sec, but we're getting a lot of comments along the lines of this comment from Carrie Crowley, who says on Facebook, when the President of the United States can do it, why can't anyone else?
See? Exactly.
there you go.
But there's a long list, right? Like, I think part of my issue of setting that precedent of you're not allowed to go on stage, you're not allowed to do your craft, is where do you draw that line? Is Mike Tyson, should he not be in movies? He was convicted. Chris
He was
Brown,
convicted of horrific crimes.
Yeah.
So should he
Certainly,
not be in
but
movies?
did you watch The Hangover?
Look, I mean, yeah, I watched The Hangover and I love it,
that
right?
should have been a
And his
problem
one-man
back
show,
then,
his one-man
and it
show, which was
wasn't.
unbelievable.
But Mike Tyson's still in pop culture. Chris Brown, who it
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
sexual assault,
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
just old-fashioned
Beating-
assault
beating up
to
women.
someone who we know. We saw the photos, we have the receipts. People are singing his songs. He's performing down the street at the Scotiabank Arena. No one seems to care about that. So my issue is, why are we? If we're going to draw the line here, we need to be consistent across the board. And if we're not comfortable with that, then we shouldn't all of a sudden be caught up in the moment of outrage culture that we have right now.
Exactly. Well, and I just wish that people were discerning of that when they make their consumption.
Moral art
Yeah.
fails. Morality
No,
in
but
art
that's not
fails.
true.
It is absolutely true.
Dolly Parton is
Moral
very wholesome
movements,
despite
moral movements,
dressing like
movements that
prostitutes.
want to make people better through art. That's not why
Oh,
people go to
so
art.
that's what you meant by moral art.
Yeah.
I thought you meant not having a PhD.
Chaste.
Yes.
No, I just thought.
Yes, remember that I have a PhD,
Yes, I know.
so I'm
Darn,
right.
beaten again. But you can create good art, can't you, and not be an assailant?
Absolutely.
No.
Yeah, I would like to hope so.
Yeah, of course
What
you
has
can.
Beyonce done?
I think
need
you would
to
hope so,
know.
but like, I mean, art has always possessed that edge of the demonic.
But as a society, we still have the right.
But we don't go to art for we go to art for what society won't give us, and you know, society won't give us honesty. It won't give us, and society wants us to be moral. We go to art for the opposite.
I love the fact that you're debating this point because I
Yeah.
don't actually believe that you totally support it in your heart. I think you're making this as a debating point, and I respect that. But in reality, can't you have, and I ask this rhetorically because I think the answer is yes, can't you celebrate great art, have great art, and at the same time demand that the people that you elevate to positions of superstardom, let's say to them, listen, if you want to have that position in our society, we are going to have a moral code. And we're not going to push you off this pedestal if you yell at somebody in public in an elevator, but if you do something we feel there is a line, and if you cross that line, we will act.
The opposite. It's when
we
you
have
cross
to.
the line that they want you. Do you like the Rolling Stones?
Yes.
Are they the best rock band of all time?
Well, I don't
What about
know.
Altamont?
But
But
we also
yes,
look at
People
our
died.
superstars
They made a
as-
deal with the Hells Angels
Yes.
in which people died.
Yes. For those
So-
of you who are Donovan's age,
Yeah.
the Rolling Stones were
We're
a
a
rock
band.
group.
God, I am 3 years younger than Donovan. I don't know why he always gets the brunt of this.
You seem,
You're smarter than I am.
and you're a mother now.
Yeah.
So you have all
Jesus.
the.
No,
So
but we look at celebrities as role models too. Like they
Yes.
take that on.
Yes.
So that is a thing.
Who looks at celebrities like role models?
oh, lots
Oh
of
my God,
people do.
so
Come
many
like
on.
Kanye
people
West,
do.
well-known role model.
No, but
Oh, come on. The people
Kim
you're
Kardashian
selecting
is the most
are-
famous woman in the world. How did she become that? By accidentally appearing in a porn tape. That is how you become famous. You don't become famous by being a moral avatar.
Well, there's many people who
You
became
become-
famous because they have
How
great
come,
talent,
like,
right?
Yeah,
Like,
there's
I
different
think-
You become
contexts,
famous by
too.
scandal.
There's different contexts too. Like Demi Lovato did a song, wrote a song called "Sober," like basically apologizing for having issues with substance abuse. And so, like, she understands her audience looks to her as a role model.
We like
so
the
she feels
wrong
like she's
uns.
let them down.
Well,
so I think you know what I mean. Like I think there's more complex than how you're painting it. I think.
Well, okay, so let's move on to a different topic, though, because, it's at times like this that I need to ask you about Disney princesses.
Yeah, see, that's a great segue from Demi Lovato
natural
and role models. I just created the best segue for you.
Do you have a
your
son or
face
a
is
daughter?
priceless.
A son.
A son?
Yeah.
So my sons are in their 20s now, so sort of hosting birthday parties, and that's, for little kids is long in my past.
Come host birthday parties for my child.
Yeah.
I'll outsource it.
But people I know who have daughters who have birthday party, daughters who are like 7, 8, 9 years old, find themselves sometimes among my circle of friends and acquaintances conflicted about the extent to which many young girls adore Disney princesses. And aren't sure as parents, especially mothers, how they should respond to that. This is not something you've
Well, I mean, I think as a parent in general, like you should, if you have
now
a son
you're speaking as a parent?
As a parent in general. I have three weeks as a parent. No, but the reason we're talking about this now is Kristen Bell, who was the princess in Frozen, which is hugely
Great, thank you. Yes,
yeah,
please
I'm giving
give
you
us
the news
context.
peg
Yeah.
because the
Thank you,
host of
because
the
I
National
clearly
is not
didn't do
doing
that. Yeah.
his job.
Yeah.
So
It's true. I was not doing my job, so that's fine.
I'll do it for you, don't worry. Kristen Bell, who is Frozen, is like the most popular, I think, modern fairy tale, and they've done a lot of work to make sure that they were quite progressive in the positioning, very, empowered kind of main character as the princess there. But she had pointed out that when she reads traditional fairy tales to her children, she'll have conversations about, don't you think it's weird that Snow White never asked the witch, like, where she got that apple? Or isn't it kind of creepy that Sleeping Beauty didn't consent to that kiss that she got? And so I think the whole conversation too is like, do we apply these moral standards to very old stories, and is there still something useful in what they're telling us? And I think you do need to look at these stories with a little bit more of a modern lens. And I don't think that it's not telling the stories anymore, but I think it's useful that Kristen Bell is having conversations with her kids about it. Like, you're reading these stories in the modern times, and you have to deal with modern standards, and they are supposed to be instructive. And back in the day, it was very much like, the stories were a lot more, like stay away from, I don't know. They're much more arcane in what they're trying to teach kids, and so I think you can sort of update them through having conversations. And I think princess culture is a thing, and a lot of girls will look at princesses and aspire to be them. And I think it maddens a lot of moms that I know because they maybe try to pull them back from it, and it seems like a magnet either way. But I think it's really helpful to engage on that with your kid, and I think that Kristen Bell opened a really good conversation that way.
Aren't you curious about how a former professor with a PhD in early modern drama deals with these issues?
It keeps me up at night. It's
know.
what I want to know.
I know.
Let me know.
That's what the market
your
has decided. The
textbook,
market,
right? You wrote
that's
a
what the
textbook.
market wants. That's why Facebook Live is so huge. Do you want to know? Was that your way of asking me my thoughts?
What do you
That was my
think?
segue,
Because
yeah.
you're going to tell
Well,
us
I
anyway.
hate these things. I mean, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and mercifully we've escaped most of it. Although it is fascinating when you have kids how it doesn't matter how gender neutral you are. Like, it's like you probably had this, Ian, with boys and guns, right? Like, it doesn't matter what you do. Like, you can give your son a Barbie doll. He will fold it over and point it at another kid and pretend it's a gun.
Yeah, my wife kept trying to keep guns away from, like toy guns, away from our kids. And then I'm trying to think if this was like a real story or a joke. I think it was a real story that she said one of our friends who had sons made a gun out of a grilled cheese sandwich.
Right.
Like just bit a gun out of that in order to have a gun-like shape.
And I
Wow,
think
that's quite
princesses are a bit like. I mean,
Or
I
artistic.
really hate these movies. I really think they're.
The old school movies, or
The old
any
school
of them?
ones are straight up racist, Jim Crow. I mean, if you go back into history, but like for example, a movie like The Little Mermaid. The lesson of The Little Mermaid is a girl should give up her voice.
Yeah.
Because
No,
she's
it's so
fallen in love
arcane.
with a guy that she knows nothing about.
Yeah.
This is the exact, literally the exact opposite of what I want my daughters and sons to know. The rest of them are just pretty bad as art. And, and of course what they do is they take these unbelievably fantastic stories that are terrifying and that children love when you read them to them. Like if you read Hansel and Gretel to 4 or 5-year-olds, like they feel it. Being abandoned in the woods and like your stepmother hates you and all this stuff. They really get it. And it just sucks all the drama and life out of it.
Let me read one of the comments that we have here. Omar Debuz, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, on Facebook says, nothing wrong with Disney princesses as long as the message they convey is one of self-respect and equality. There are many princesses in global history that changed the world. But I guess your point is that some of these stories don't necessarily have that kind of positive.
I have no problem with a princess in and of itself. It's just I hate all the versions that they've ever done of them.
Donovan, you can take a pass on this.
No,
it's
no,
quite
I mean,
possible in
What's
your
your thoughts about what's the
Princess opinion.
sports
You can have
that
princess opinions. I want to hear your princess opinion.
I think the interesting thing about this and the recent Disney movies are much more progressive. I think these are time capsules of the
Yes,
time.
yes. Yeah.
And how the greater culture felt about women and how much power they should have. And so I think, to your point, it should be that. It should be the start of a conversation.
Totally.
It's no longer watching them pretending that that doesn't exist and it never has existed.
Yeah.
I don't think is helpful for anyone, but it is an accurate reflection. You're talking about mothers worried about how their daughters feel. It's an accurate reflection of how women of all ages feel, based on the way our society has at times made women kind of a marginalized creature.
If I have to hear that
Yeah.
Frozen song one more time,
Yeah, see, I
I swear to
totally
God,
missed this.
I'm gonna, oh man.
Let it go.
In our house, like I missed all this, and so yeah, so I consider myself.
But no, but if we want
Lucky.
to talk about like art, and I think the important thing about this conversation is that it is a reflection of our morals in
That
society
is true.
too.
Those
so that's,
Disney movies
that's
are.
why it's complex.
They are moral movies. If you
Yeah.
want morality in art, Disney princess movies, that's what
But
you're
in,
gonna
but in
get.
culture and art in general, I think
No.
it's a reflection. And I think like
just don't
looking at
wanna hear
everything
it.
as demonic is not necessarily helpful.
Or true.
Or true. It's
Yeah.
more complex than that.
Exactly. Way more complex,
This
Stephen,
is
than
my thesis
wanna-
that I'm going
pick
to
do you want to
defend.
pick a favorite artist and we'll find out if they're demonic?
Elton John.
Well, he was certainly blacklisted from society for a long time. He would not have been considered a social ideal. Quite the opposite. He was
Because he's gay.
Because he was gay, and
Yeah.
he had to hide it. And there was something very much other about him
Yeah,
for
well,
his
that-
entire
That
life.
was
You're not
that was
saying that makes
society,
him
though.
demonic.
Who
He gave
you know,
to society what it didn't want. He was definitely immoral. What he did was literally illegal for most of his life.
But
Like-
what he was being was true to himself.
Yes, so let's
Well, that's what
define
the artist.
demonic.
That's what,
Yeah,
that's what
but-
Caravaggio
so-
was doing too when he killed those people. Like, I mean, that's right. He was being true to himself and not to society. That's what Elton John was doing.
Yeah.
But like-
So just in case you've flipped on your computer in the middle of this conversation, let me just
Caravaggio.
at one point
Caravaggio and Elton John.
Stephen was suggesting
an
that you know art is demonic and that people sell their soul to the devil in order to be successful artists. And then he asked me to name an artist, and then he would prove his point. I said Elton John,
And I won.
He said Elton John is demonic because at a time
I said he was not moral.
he's not moral in the eyes of the people who felt that his sexual orientation was not moral. But that doesn't make him not moral.
But that it would make he was definitely a complete outcast from society in his daily life.
Yeah, well, like in 1975.
That's right, when he was
had
making the art
like
that
5
mattered.
#1 singles.
That's right.
Hardly an outcast.
But that's it. The art. Caravaggio wasn't an outcast either. He made all this art that was bought by everyone, except that he was absolutely an outcast
Yeah, see,
because he was a murderer.
In the podcast that doesn't exist, that Stephen and I do, each episode takes about 90 minutes to discuss one thing.
Probably define demonic too off the top, but anyway.
Al Ohm says the reality of using media to teach values rather than at home is the real issue. John Willett says Disney has a learning curve too. I think the characters are evolving, perhaps a little bit too slowly, but they are.
Yeah.
The princesses are displaying courage and bravery, determination in the face of adversity, and independence more these days.
See, I think
way
That's
to
a
that.
mirror to what's going on in society, as you were saying.
I did that too, though.
I think media is a great use of having conversations with home. I think you need to meet the child at their level and have them engaged in something that they actively care about,
Yeah.
have stake in. I mean, I feel like media should be used more in schools as far as
Should be more
getting
literacy
across
about it.
to kids. And this is a conversation, forget about the age of Disney, whether it's, if we're talking about girls in this situation, when they get older and the teen magazines that they read and the messaging
Yeah.
that's them, they're going to be feeling these societal pressures all the way up through adulthood.
Yeah.
And so having that conversation and then being cognizant and aware of the way things were and still systemically in many ways are, I think is important.
So we are going to have our pop panel on the National tonight, and we're going to be having a version of this conversation, but different things. They're going to use different words.
Maybe less Caravaggio on TV tonight? I don't know.
Well, how
And,
much would you pay me if I could say Caravaggio on it?
Yeah, it's impressive. We're going to wrap in just a moment, but one of the things we do on the pop panel is we discuss these topics beforehand, but I'm going to throw something out here in the remaining 2 or 3 minutes, maybe make it 2 minutes, that we haven't talked about at all. Netflix is about to drop season 2 of Making a Murderer.
Oh,
Did you guys see season 1?
Oh, yeah.
See it,
So, you know, Serial, the podcast, plus Making a Murder has created this whole genre of, they're no longer than documentaries, but like real life crime reporting. Any thoughts about that genre or Making a Murderer specifically?
It's really interesting because it is the key in all of it is that there's some systemic problem, and all of you as listeners and viewers have a stake in grappling with that. And so I think it's really interesting though, because like real people's lives are kind of in the balance. And there's a really interesting story by Simon Howard in the Globe and Mail a couple weeks ago about that. I think it was Thanksgiving weekend, just really talking about like the impact on people who are affected by.
Oh, I didn't see that. So
Yeah,
I will
it's
read
really
that.
interesting. So he talked about Serial, and so you know, I think during when that was at sort of its height, there was a relative of the victim, of the person who'd been murdered. I'm just saying, like, hang on, everyone. Like, you're all kind of like armchair detectives here, and this is my life.
That's
You know,
really
that's kind of really being affected here. That said, I think it's a very interesting form, and I think it's a really interesting form for investigative journalism in a lot of ways too. There's a In the Dark is a really good one
I was just,
that I love.
yeah, yes.
It's great.
But again, it's based on sort of a systemic problem.
Yeah.
And I think like that's a healthy way to look at it if we were really interested and invested in changing things for the better. A lot of it really, though, is just entertainment. Not necessarily a bad thing, you know, on that front too, but
It's more than
it's
just
very
entertainment,
gripping.
though, isn't it? Yeah.
No, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Like it's a blend of it.
Yeah.
It depends on your motivation for watching it, and I think it can be both. You know, but it's certainly gripping, and it's interesting because way back when, like, is it Nancy Grace or like one of the CNN
Nancy
TV
Grace,
show,
absolutely.
which is, it's like there's clearly an appetite for moral outrage too.
Well, in her
as a
case,
lot
yeah, sort of lurid, you know,
yes,
kind of coverage
deep
of crime.
crime and details, and just really being a voyeur on that.
Yeah,
and
totally.
There's
Yeah,
a real
very
interesting
little journalism
investment.
practiced on that.
Yeah, there's a real investment in that, which is interesting
yeah.
in these kinds of shows.
Very
yeah.
thoughtful. Can I ask for just a couple of quick comments on that whole genre, if you?
Well, I've had more heated conversations about Brendan Dassey in the last
Wow,
year or so
that's really
than, I don't know,
interesting. Yeah,
than Caravaggio for sure, but than anyone. But
Wait till tonight. We'll fight
right,
about
of
it,
course. The thing for me, my main takeaway, you know, having watched it and seeing the phenomenon that Making a Murderer was how many people were surprised that Lady Justice's bell doesn't necessarily
I know.
ring,
It's so true.
you know,
Yes.
even for everyone. I mean, I was like, really? This is new to
This
you?
is
This has
surprising.
been an
We
issue.
work in the media too, though, so we're a little bit more aware, maybe.
Certainly, but it's something that I, you know, as a minority male, was
Yes.
certainly aware
Much
of.
more aware than the ordinary listener.
Yeah,
for
so,
sure.
so for me, I found that conversation interesting and I think insightful.
I mean, to me, it's like, I love this stuff. I love all this stuff. You know, David Shields is one of my favorite writers. He once said we have to start writing stories for the phone, and that's what these are. They're beautiful stories for the phone. They're like perfect to listen to on your phone when you're out on the street, when you're just around, when you're just walking. I mean, especially the podcasts about this stuff. I love it, and they're beautiful character studies.
Yeah.
I mean, as opposed to all the the political stuff is very interesting and so on. But actually, I think what draws people to them is that they're very fascinating studies of individual people and communities, right? And like the communities that impact on them. An amazing genre.
We should talk more about this on a pop panel in the future, but thank you guys very much. Thank you for those of you who were watching on the various streams and also sending in comments. And tonight on The National, both online, but of course on CBC Television and CBC News Network, we will have the pop panel again, and we will talk some more. This is kind of our warm-up to the taping of the pop
We're
panel.
gonna sit in
So
different chairs, right?
we'll sit in different chairs, yeah. So thank you very much for watching.
Thanks.
So we'll still be up on this stream for a little bit.